This episode is brought to you by Prime. What if you had one more chance with the one that got away?
Sam.
You came home.
Based on the best-selling novel from Carly Fortune. Every Year After follows childhood friends Sam and Percy as they reunite in the dreamy, nostalgic lakeside town of Barry's Bay.
Love can be hard to find. So if you're lucky enough to find that person, never let go.
A second chance at first love. Every Year After, now streaming only on Prime.
Tamworth Castle rises above the meeting point of the River Tame and the River Anker. Its stone walls and earthworks standing at the centre of a landscape that has been occupied, defended and reshaped for well over 1,000 years. From a distance, the castle appears almost compressed into the town around it, enclosed now by roads, shops and modern buildings. But the mound beneath still dominates the ground in the same way it would have done centuries ago, when Tamworth stood at the heart of the old kingdom of Mercia. Long before the Norman Castle was built, this was already a place of importance. Tamworth had become one of the principal royal centres of Mercia during the Anglo-Saxon period, associated particularly with kings such as Offa in the 8th century. It was not a frontier outpost or isolated stronghold, but a political centre, a place from which authority spread across large parts of what is now central England. The rivers mattered enormously. The crossing point here connected routes running north and south through the Midlands, while the surrounding land provided both defence and access. Like many early power centres, Tamworth occupied a landscape where geography and politics worked together. That importance brought danger with it. In 874, the Viking Great Heathen Army wintered in Tamworth during the wars that destabilised Mercia, and although the surviving records are sparse, the occupation marked a major turning point in the history of the region. The town later became part of the frontier between English-controlled territory and the Danelaw. In 913, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians and daughter of Alfred the Great, ordered the fortification of Tamworth as part of a wider defensive network across Mercia. Contemporary records describe the construction of a burh here, a defended settlement protected by earthworks and timber fortifications. The great mound beneath the present castle is often connected to these Saxon defences, although the exact relationship between the earlier burh and the later Norman castle remains debated. The Normans transformed the site after the conquest. A motte and bailey castle was established here during the late 11th century, probably for Robert Despenser, a royal official whose family held the manor before it passed to the Marmion family. The new rulers of England imposed castles not simply for defence, but as physical statements of control. Tamworth was no exception. The enormous motte was reshaped and strengthened, deep ditches cut around it, and timber defences raised above the town. Archaeological investigations carried out during the 20th century revealed the scale of those earthworks more clearly. Excavations near the gatehouse found sections of the defensive ditch measuring roughly 16 metres across and 7 metres deep, evidence of a fortress designed to dominate both the settlement and the surrounding approaches. During the 12th century, the castle gradually changed from timber into stone. Under the Marmions, the summit of the motte was enclosed by a shell keep, a circular defensive wall built around the crest of the mound. Much of the surviving stonework dates from this period, although the building seen today is the result of centuries of additions and alterations. Later medieval owners extended and adapted the castle repeatedly. The Frevilles inherited it after the Marmion line ended in 1291, and in the 15th century the Ferrers family made substantial changes, including the construction of the Great Hall. Tudor alterations softened some of the more defensive features, turning sections of the castle into a residence as much as a military structure. The archaeology of the site reflects that gradual evolution. Rather than one single phase of construction, Tamworth Castle contains layers from different centuries, compressed into the same structure. Beneath the later interiors are Norman walls and medieval foundations, while below the mound itself, there may still be traces of earlier Saxon landscape. Recent archaeological work around the castle grounds and the old mill area near Holloway has added further depth to the story. Community excavations carried out in recent years identified remains linked to historic milling activity, probably medieval in origin, reminding us that the castle was not isolated from ordinary working life. Water management, milling, trade and industry all formed part of the wider landscape around the fortress. By the 18th century, the castle had lost much of its military purpose. Like many old strongholds, it survived because it adapted. Georgian owners remodelled parts of the interior, and 19th century restoration work altered the appearance again, particularly during the Victorian fascination with medieval architecture and romanticised history. In 1897, the corporation purchased the building, and 2 years later it opened as a public museum. Since then, generations of visitors have walked through rooms that contain not just objects from the past, but stories attached to the building itself. Those stories are one of the reasons Tamworth Castle remains well known beyond Staffordshire. Unlike some supposedly haunted locations where the paranormal claims feel disconnected from the actual history, the folklore here emerged directly from older local traditions tied to the castle, the abbey at Polesworth, and the medieval families who controlled the region. The best known story concerns the figure now commonly called the Black Lady. The legend itself is old, though the form in which it survives today appears to have evolved gradually over centuries. According to later medieval tradition, one of the Marmion lords seized lands associated with Polesworth Abbey and expelled the nuns. During the night, he was supposedly visited by a spectral female figure, sometimes identified as Saint Æthelflæd, who struck him with a crozier and warned him to restore what had been taken. By morning, according to the story, he relented and returned the property. The historical background to the tale is more complicated than the legend suggests. There genuinely were connections between the Marmion family and Polesworth Abbey, and disputes involving land and ecclesiastical rights were common throughout medieval England. However, the dramatic supernatural details appear in much later sources rather than contemporary records. Historians generally treat the story as a moral legend, shaped by monastic tradition, intended to reinforce the consequences of interfering with church property. Even so, the story became deeply attached to the castle itself, and over time the religious figure at its centre evolved into something darker and less clearly defined. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the apparition was being described not as a saintly warning, but as a haunting presence within the castle. Reports vary considerably, but the figure is usually described as a woman in dark clothing, seen in the older parts of the building, particularly around the Norman Tower. The details are often vague, and many accounts come second-hand, but the persistence of the story over such a long period is notable. Staff and visitors have continued to refer to the Black Lady into modern times, and the castle itself now openly acknowledges the legend as part of its public history. One of the more frequently repeated accounts involves experiences reported by museum staff working alone in the building after closing hours. Several former employees have described hearing footsteps on staircases when no visitors remained inside the castle. In most cases, the sounds were not described dramatically. What unsettled people was their apparent normality. The footsteps sounded like someone moving through the building in an ordinary way, climbing stairs or crossing corridors, only for staff to discover the rooms empty when checked. Such reports are impossible to verify now, and many survive only through retellings. But they appear consistently across local accounts over several decades. The Ferrers Room has also become associated with unexplained disturbances. Stories connected with the room often involve the sound of furniture moving across the floor late at night. Again, the claims are difficult to trace to single identifiable incidents, but the tradition appears in both local folklore and later paranormal publications. What makes the stories interesting is not necessarily the suggestion of supernatural activity itself, but the way they reflect the building's long transition from fortress to residence to museum. Large empty rooms, old timber floors, changes in temperature, and centuries of structural movement all create an environment where ordinary sounds easily acquire meaning, particularly after dark in an isolated medieval building. Other reported experiences are quieter and less theatrical than many modern ghost stories. Some visitors have spoken of hearing low voices in otherwise empty areas of the castle. Not clear enough to distinguish words, but enough to suggest conversation nearby. Others have described sudden changes in temperature in specific rooms, or the feeling that someone else was present in spaces that appeared empty. These are subjective experiences rather than evidence, and the castle's age and atmosphere undoubtedly influence how people interpret them, but they form part of the wider body of stories surrounding the site. A smaller number of accounts concern apparitions beyond the Black Lady herself. Local folklore occasionally mentions a white lady associated with parts of the castle, though this figure is less clearly defined and may represent a later addition influenced by wider British ghost traditions. There are also stories of phantom horses heard within the grounds, particularly at quieter times in the evening. Given the castle's military history and its centuries of association with mounted retainers, travellers and soldiers, it is not difficult to see how such stories developed naturally within local imagination. Modern paranormal investigations have further reinforced the castle's reputation. In recent years, Tamworth Castle has hosted organised ghost hunts and live stream investigations, some attracting very large online audiences. Investigators have reported unusual sounds, sensations, and equipment readings within the building. These events belong to more contemporary paranormal culture than historical evidence, and they should probably be viewed in that context. Nevertheless, they demonstrate how strongly the castle continues to occupy the public imagination. Medieval castles have long attracted ghost stories because they already carry visible signs of age, conflict, and survival. The atmosphere exists before any paranormal interpretation begins. What makes Tamworth Castle particularly interesting is that its folklore emerged from genuine historical tensions already present within the site itself. The Black Lady legend did not appear randomly. It grew from real medieval disputes involving land, authority, and religion, then gradually transformed through later retelling into a haunting narrative. Victorian restoration and 19th century fascination with Gothic history helped shape the version people recognise today. In that sense, the ghost story tells us much about changing attitudes towards history as it does about the supernatural. Even without the hauntings, The castle remains one of the most important surviving medieval sites in the Midlands. The mound still carries traces of Saxon landscape beneath it. Norman military engineering survives within the earthworks and stone walls. Tudor and Georgian alterations reveal how each generation adapted the building to its own needs. Walking through the castle today means moving through nearly 1,000 years of continuous occupation, layered into a single structure. And perhaps that is why places like this continue to gather stories around them. Not because they're necessarily haunted in any provable sense, but because history accumulates there so densely that the boundary between memory, folklore, and physical place begins to blur. Tamworth Castle has stood through Viking occupation, Norman Conquest, civil unrest, religious conflict, and centuries of rebuilding. It has changed purpose repeatedly, while still remaining fundamentally the same landmark above the rivers. The stories attached to it may never be resolved. The Black Lady may be nothing more than an old moral legend, reshaped by Victorian imagination and modern paranormal culture. The footsteps and voices may have perfectly ordinary explanations hidden within the fabric of an ancient building. But the stories persist because the castle itself persists, carrying the weight of every century that has passed through it. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the podcast and get access to MP3s over on buymeacoffee.com/ghost tales. They are £1.50 each, or free if you're a member. You can find everything at ghosttales.co.uk and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Ghost Tales Podcast.
You have one new message. Translating. Disney and Pixar's Hoppers is now available on Disney+.
You could say that again.
Critics are calling it Pixar's funniest movie ever and a wildly entertaining ride. Blizzard Potato. It's certified fresh and verified hot.
Now we party.
This is incredible!
Wow, I am clearing the rest of the day.
Disney and Pixar's Hoppers now available on Disney+. Rated PG.